My name is Jason. I'm going to talk about what's new in Gatsby. A little bit about me. I am human duct tape at Gatsby. That means that I work in DevRel. I do a little bit of management, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. If it needs getting done, I'll probably be the one to try it out and do a half-an-assed job. I formerly was a front-end architect at IBM and left IBM to come to Gatsby. I'm also a failed musician, an amateur bartender, and I'm living in Portland, Oregon. So before I talk about what's new in Gatsby, I want to do a quick overview of what is Gatsby. I was talking to Timothy over here before the meetup and realized that not everybody's going to know what it is, so I'll do the fast version. So first, what is Gatsby? Gatsby is a shortcut to allow developers to quickly build excellent apps and sites. And what I mean by that is that most workflows today require a lot of boilerplate. So if you take your standard concept of trying to write some code and get it up into the browser, you're going to find yourself first having to configure Webpack. Then you got to configure Babel. Then you got to get something like PostCSS in there. Then you're finding yourself building a node server. Next thing you know, you're onto Kubernetes, and then you're setting up Nginx in front of that, and you're trying to deploy it all to a CDN. And before you write this off as a contrived example, this is almost exactly what we used to do at IBM. Gatsby is an attempt to remove that boilerplate. We want you to be able to get something up and running really fast so that you start a Gatsby project and you write code, and the only code you write is code for your project. So the process looks something like this. You start up with Gatsby, you build the thing using React and GraphQL, and then when you're done, you just toss it up on Netlify or into an S3 bucket or whatever your preferred flavor of CDN is. Another thing that Gatsby does, it's an orchestration layer for taking the content mesh. The content mesh is something that our co-founder Sam Bhagwat put forward as a redistribution of content control. So our position is that the monolithic CMS is dying. Things like WordPress and Drupal that were an all-in-one solution. Magento is another one where you would use the same thing for your database, for your content management, and for your front end. That's becoming less and less true as time goes on. The future that we're seeing is what we call the content mesh, which is this idea of lots and lots of services that are best in class for something that you then stitch together in some way to build an excellent app and don't have to make trade-offs between like, well, this is really good at e-commerce, but it's really bad at blogging, so I guess we'll just deal with a bad blogging experience because we need the e-commerce. So what this looks like is, you know, if you think of a traditional monolithic app, if you were to have to build this, you would be looking for, okay, what's the most important thing on this page? And then you would find a tool that was good at that thing, and everything else would just have to get shoehorned into that tool. But with the content mesh, you just get to pick the best in class at whatever it is. And you know, I put logos up here. That's not to assert that I have opinions about which thing is best in class. It's just some examples here. But you know, if you want to do search, you grab Algolia. If you want to do image assets, you grab Cloudinary. If you want to manage content, use Contentful. You want to do e-commerce, use Stripe. You use the tool you want. You use the tool that's best for your use case, and then you stitch them all together to get a great content experience. How this works in Gatsby is that you pull any content you want into Gatsby. We stitch that together in a normalized GraphQL layer. You then get to your content using React and GraphQL, and it doesn't matter where your data came from. The access to that is going to be roughly the same. It's going to feel really familiar. Once you're done, we're going to build that out into static assets that you can then throw up on S3 or Netlify or Google Cloud or whatever your thing is. And finally, and this is important, once it gets back to the browser, we rehydrate into a React app. So that means that Gatsby is a progressive web app generator. And our ultimate goal here is we want to make the right thing the easy thing. And what I mean by that is that we kind of operate under the assumption that developers are going to end up under deadlines. Even the people with the best intentions are going to eventually have to cut some corners to meet a tight timeline. And so we want to make sure that that default experience, the laziest, shortcuttiest, under the gunniest experience you can have, results in a great experience both for you as a developer and for the people who have to use your website. And the way that we do that is we set a bunch of good defaults. We're going to set up the purple pattern, and that's code splitting and prefetching and all of these things that get recommended by industry performance experts like Adi Osmani. We're also going to generate only static assets. There is no server round trip other than to the CDN. You're not having to wait for a server data request to complete. It's just static assets that get served up. That also means that your deployments are cheap. You don't have to worry about horizontally scaling. You don't have to worry about things like eventual consistency or sharding databases or all these things that get extraordinarily complicated when you're building apps that you, as a front-end developer, should never have to think about, right? Front-end developers shouldn't have to get a second career in DevOps in order to build world-class apps. We also optimize in lazy load assets. We're going to do things like take your images and generate all the different versions of it so that it loads at the right resolution on the right screen. We're going to lazy load those images so that you don't burn a bunch of time waiting for those to load. And we also normalize third-party data. We talked about what that means in the content mesh. And what this means for developers is that you get a lot of transferability between teams. If you work on a Gatsby site, it doesn't matter what the content stack is, because if you get moved between teams, if they're both working on Gatsby sites, it doesn't matter if one is on Drupal and one is on, I don't know, Contentful or Sanity.io or whatever newfangled thing. They could be using Google Spreadsheets. It doesn't really matter. You can use any content source, and the development experience stays about the same. While we do all that, we want to make sure that developers keep control. We want to make sure that if you need to throw a custom Webpack plugin in, you can. You want to screw with your Babel config, it's all yours. But we don't necessarily require you to eject the entire config to do that. We make our configuration composable. And we want you to be able to just change the thing you want. This is a concept that we call the progressive disclosure of complexity. If you're interested in that, I've written a blog post on it that goes a little more deeply into the philosophy of how that works, that I totally didn't put a link to on here, so sorry. All of that foundation laid. Let's talk a little bit about what's new in Gatsby, what's exciting, the kinds of things that we're working on right now. And there's a lot that's going on in Gatsby. So for anyone who isn't familiar, Gatsby got venture funding at the end of 2017. So we're just now at about 18 months of operation as an actual company and not just an open source project. Gatsby, the open source project, is, I think, 4 years old now. I think the first commits were in 2015. And in that 18 months about 18 months that we've been running, we are really working on some really exciting stuff. We shipped V2, which was a big improvement. That's where we got a lot of the content mesh stuff. And we've been working on extending that even further. So one of the things that we're most excited about is themes. We have been making a lot of noise about this. I think to the point that people are sick of hearing me talk about it, but I'm going to keep talking about it. So themes are really exciting because a Gatsby site by default is like a Gatsby config file that's full of plugins and data sources and your various assets and all this other stuff, right? And it looks something like this. It all kind of gets fit together and ultimately mashes into one Gatsby site. And this is a pretty good experience. The catch is that if you want to build two Gatsby sites, even if they're almost identical, you end up having to fork this code. And you end up with two instances of the same code. So if you make updates in one place, you have to copy paste those updates to another place. That's not a particularly good experience, especially if you're working in an agency where you have a default starter. If you end up with 15, 20, 100 client sites and you want to make boilerplate changes, that's a hell of a project. So what themes do, well, I guess, it is pretty cool. Even without themes, Gatsby's pretty cool. You get a whole bunch of power that you can shove in. This is Voltron for anybody who's not familiar with this old show. So what themes do is themes will just take all of that stuff, everything that makes a Gatsby site, and put it into a single composable package. And so composition is such a powerful concept in pretty much every aspect of programming. And we are really, really excited about this because what it means is you can take your Gatsby site and effectively turn it into a plugin. So now you don't need to have a copy of the site to run it in two places. You build one package that is the starter, and then you install it in as many sites as you want, and they all get upstream updates. That's a really, really powerful concept, and it's extremely badass. It's like when Voltron forms into the super robot. And we really do think of it like Voltron, because another thing that Gatsby themes can do is you can use multiple themes at once. You want to install a blog theme and an e-commerce theme? Cool, do it, go nuts. You want to take a blog theme and install another theme on top of it to adjust styles? Absolutely, you can do that. You want to just eject one component and rewrite it in your child theme? 100% supported. We call it component shadowing. So there's a lot of potential in here for what you can do with Gatsby themes and how much portability and composability they offer as a paradigm. So each theme is effectively a fully functioning Gatsby website. You could just install a theme and run it without using it as a plugin, and it would just work. It would just be a website. But if you install multiple themes, so the example that I gave of a blog and an e-commerce site, so imagine that you as an agency or you as a team that has a bunch of different UIs have common pieces of functionality that don't always get used and don't necessarily get used in the same way, but are pretty commonly showing up. Like if you always need to install a newsletter opt-in, it's not going to be exactly the same. It's not going to be in the same place, but you're going to need all that functionality. You're going to need to be able to submit that form. You're going to need to have the form elements and all the different controls and validation and all these things that happen. So cool. Package it up into a Gatsby theme. Install it. Then you take your blog theme, or if it's not a blog, maybe it's a shop. You have your shop theme and you install that as well. And then you just drop that opt-in right into it. They compose together. You didn't have to write any code. You just installed two things that were pre-configured for you. Then you can override the styles of both with a single tokens file. And holy shit, you just built a completely custom website in like, what was it, Chris? 9 lines of code and some curly braces or something? I mean, it's a really, really powerful concept. We're seeing some very cool things. And because themes are composable, you can stack them together both horizontally and vertically. So if you want to, we talked about horizontal, a e-commerce and an opt-in and a blog all snapped in horizontally. But then once you got those there, you can also snap more themes on top of those that are like child themes in WordPress if you've ever worked with that. Selectively override certain pieces of the parent theme to customize it to your liking or to extend it with additional functionality. You want to have a blog post, maybe by default, it's just got a title and the date, and you want to add an author thing, cool, extend it. Extend it with an author component and do selective overriding, and you've got it. You've got a blog with an author. You didn't have to rewrite or re-implement the entire blog stack. You just implemented the things that you wanted. Another thing that we're extremely excited about inside of Gatsby is schema customization. So this is a little lower level, but it's got a whole lot of possibilities for theme and plugin authors, and even if you're just building something that's a little ambitious without any themes or plugins. Inside of Gatsby, we now have APIs that'll allow you to create custom types for any kind of data layer that you want. And so what this might look like is, if you're familiar with GraphQL, you can see that this is a GraphQL type. It takes a my custom node as the name of the type, and it implements node, which is a Gatsby interface. And that's going to give it all sorts of things for sorting and filtering and miscellaneous other things. And then we just define that it has a name, and that name is a string, right? So this is us basically saying to Gatsby, I should be able to use this data type in my app, even if no data of that type exists. That's pretty powerful. I mean, if this looks like gobbledygook to you, like, don't worry about it. This is, like I said, this is kind of an advanced feature. We also allow you to create custom resolvers. So if I wanted to have an ability to just look up some stuff, and I didn't necessarily want to write a bunch of code for it, I just wanted it to be available, I can just toss in a resolver like this. Now I would have access to a query called getGoodStuff that will always return an array of whiskey, puppies, and dessert, which, who wouldn't want that? So this is another really powerful way to just give your apps something custom without having to do a whole bunch of workarounds. Previously you would have had to put this into some kind of a data store and then use a transformer to throw it in. Now you can just do this natively. Just drop it in as a resolver and it's going to work. This solves some old gotchas. So if anybody in here has written a Gatsby plugin before, if you started up a Gatsby site and you hadn't defined the schema, if you didn't have a data type, like if you were expecting Markdown and that Markdown was going to have front matter and a title, and you didn't have any Markdown files yet, you'd get an error because it's like looking for the, there is no front matter title field, and it would throw an error and it would complain and it was really scary. And so you had to put like dummy content into things. This way, when you put in the schema, you're able to just get an empty array back, and then you can handle it as like no posts exist, as opposed to having to put in dummy content and deal with that. This also makes by default, will infer schema. And so that could mean before that you would end up with something like front matter _2 or something like that, which wasn't necessarily something that you would often use, but like it's kind of nice to just know that the fields are always going to have the same types and names. So this is just some stuff that if you were dealing with Gatsby under the hood could have been a pain in the ass, but if you never saw it, don't worry, you never will. It also opens up new possibilities, one of which is generic data types. So something that I think is really, really powerful here is if you were to define, let's say, a blog post type, and that has a title, an author, and some categories and like the content. Where does that data come from? Like, does it really matter in the context of a blog? Does it have to be Markdown or WordPress or Drupal? Well, using this model, it doesn't have to be from anywhere. It can be any type. You can define a generic data type, and then you can write an adapter that would make WordPress types conform to that generic type, or Drupal types, or Shopify types, or whatever you wanted to use. All of those then can be drawn into your blog, which means that if you were to be using this type of setup and you didn't want to use WordPress anymore, you could migrate to a different blogging platform with no code changes to your UI. You would just need to make sure that you wrote an adapter for whatever your new content management system was to create the generic type. That's an extraordinarily powerful pattern if you think about what that means for long-term maintainability. You don't necessarily need to make any UI changes to completely migrate your backend. That's really, really cool. It also opens up the door for multi-source data types. So like one example is at Gatsby, we have a Markdown blog because up until very recently, Gatsby was just a pile of nerds writing code. And so if we were going to write a blog post, we were going to do that by writing a Markdown file. But we've started hiring people who aren't developers and who definitely don't want to deal with GitHub. So something that we're going to be looking at doing in the very near future is taking another blogging platform and dual sourcing that into our blog. So we're going to create a generic data type, load Markdown for the developer posts, and load whatever CMS for the marketing team and content team's posts so that they get to work in the workflow they like. We get to work in the workflow we like, and it all goes to the same place, and to the people reading the blog, they'll never know the difference. Right? This is a really, really powerful model, especially if you're working with teams across multiple parts of the organization. Like maybe your marketing team wants to use something like Adobe Experience Manager, but your docs team wants to use Markdown, and your content team wants to use whatever. They want to use Contentful. You can pull all three into the exact same data type, and it looks to Gatsby, ultimately gets used as the same content. Really, really powerful model. And there are a whole bunch of things that this is going to open up that we can't even imagine yet. We just need people to go out there and start playing with it. So we really want to see y'all get up there and start playing with this content, start seeing what you can do with custom schema types, with themes, and combinations thereof. And then the last thing, this is kind of like if you work on a big team or if you're dealing with legacy code, this is going to be a big deal. And that's why I'm showing it. If you don't work on a big team, then this is not a big deal. We can now support serving assets from a different CDN. So by default, Gatsby expects all of the assets to be compiled into a single folder and then served on something like Netlify. And that's great for most use cases, but if you're like the IBMs or the PayPals of the world, then you're going to run into this situation where the infrastructure is set up to have the site here and all of the assets over here on like cdn.paypal.net or whatever. Up until this point, it's been a huge pain in the ass to manage that use case. But thanks to the hard work of Dustin Chow on our team, he added an asset prefix config that now allows you to set what your asset CDN is. You can just toss it in cdn.example.com, and then you build with prefix paths. And that's literally it. We're going to put all of your assets on your CDN. I mean, you still have to upload them there. We're not going to do that for you. But we make sure that your site is built in such a way that the CDN will be used. And that's going to be really powerful for people who are like migrating legacy apps over time, or who have already put a bunch of time into their deployment pipeline and don't necessarily want to rip everything out to try out using Gatsby. So this unblocks large team workflows, like I said. I don't know, it's hard to call this one exciting. This is more like we've removed a pain in certain types of teams' ass, and we're really happy about that. But yeah, there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on. And then ultimately, that's kind of a wrap up. I do every Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific, I do a live stream. It's about 90 minutes where we just build some shit. And it's a lot of fun. I pull in people from other teams. This morning I was on with the AWS Amplify team, and we built a little app with that. Next week I'm going on with, I'm drawing a blank now. But I've got, Henry Zhu from Babel is coming on. We're going to do a bunch of things with the Gatsby core team to build out themes and play with some ideas like theme UI microservices, which I'm really excited about. We're going to look at like different styling patterns with Jackson and a whole bunch of other really, really powerful patterns. So yeah, I'd love to have people come on and watch along. Those all get posted to YouTube, so if you can't watch live, they will be available. But that's a good way to see what's new in Gatsby and kind of what we're working on and excited about. And that's all I got. Thank you so much.